In the scorching August of 1996, a profound silence lay over the high desert of northern Arizona. The air, thick with the scent of sagebrush and the red dust that clung to everything, seemed to hold its breath. This vast land was more than just home for John B., a 36-year-old Navajo man. It was a sacred trust. He had spent years tirelessly fighting against the powerful outsiders who were scarring his ancestral lands. John was a fierce advocate, exposing the corruption that allowed mining companies to pollute rivers and ravage the earth. He was relentless in his mission, but on one particular evening, as he helped his 2-year-old daughter, Mary, into his old blue Chevy pickup, his focus was not on politics, but on his family. Mary was a delicate little girl with a round face and big brown eyes that never left her father. She had been born with a condition called bilateral club foot, which caused both of her feet to turn sharply inward. This made her shuffle rather than walk straight. While some in the community pitied her and others cruelly whispered that she was marked, John and his wife, Sarah, saw Mary as a divine gift, the very light of their lives. She adored her rag doll, which she dragged everywhere, often stumbling but always with a laugh. Her uneven steps left a unique and unforgettable impression. On the night of August 12th, John told Sarah he was going to check on a grazing allotment, a pretense for him to investigate the illegal activity he had been documenting. He had noticed suspicious truck tracks on restricted roads and heavy equipment parked too close to the canyons. He wanted to get a final look before a council meeting later that week. It was supposed to be a quick trip, just a few hours. When Mary tugged at his shirt, begging to go along, Sarah was hesitant. Mary was so fragile and the desert roads were dangerous. But John gave in, lifting her into the passenger seat and securing her in. As they drove off, the setting sun cast an orange glow across the mesas. That was the last time Sarah saw them. The hours stretched into a long, agonizing night. Sarah paced their small home, but no headlights ever swept across the yard. By morning, panic had set in. She desperately called relatives, drove the dirt roads herself, and pleaded with neighbors to help search. But there was no sign of the blue pickup, no tire marks or footprints near the cliffs. On the second day, she filed a missing person report. The tribal police were unhelpful. One deputy suggested they had probably just driven too far, maybe broke down, while another insinuated that John had abandoned his family. But Sarah knew her husband. He would never leave her or risk Mary's well-being on an open desert road. In the community, fearful whispers began to spread. Everyone knew John had been vocal, collecting evidence of corrupt land deals and publicly calling out officials who turned a blind eye. Just a week prior, he had stood in a council hall, waving documents and accusing men by name. "You are selling our future, our children's future," he had declared, his voice echoing through the hall. His words had made him a hero to some and a dangerous target to others. Yet Mary, a tiny, 2-year-old with crooked feet, had disappeared with him. The fact that a child had also vanished silenced the gossip, replacing it with a creeping fear. It seemed whoever had wanted John gone had made sure to erase his child, too. Sarah refused to accept that it was an accident. She scoured the canyons herself, leaving food and water behind in the desolate landscape, hoping her husband and daughter might somehow find it. She carried Mary's tiny shoes, their soles uneven from her limp, and begged authorities to look again, to check abandoned wells, old homesteads, and the deep cracks in the earth where secrets could be hidden. Each time, they dismissed her, citing the danger and lack of evidence, telling her she needed to move on. But she never did. For 14 years, she never stopped searching. Every August 12th, she lit candles and whispered her daughter's name into the wind. Over and over, she repeated the same words: "They didn't run away. Someone took them. Someone buried the truth." In 2010, the desert finally revealed its secret. A work crew clearing brush on neglected grazing land discovered the crumbling edge of an old stone well. Its opening was concealed by debris. As they lowered a hook to clear away rust and scrap metal, the chains caught on something heavy. Slowly, groaning under the immense weight, they pulled up a sealed metal trunk, covered in years of dirt. When investigators opened it, the air was heavy with the smell of decay. Inside lay two skeletons curled together, an adult male and the tiny bones of a child whose feet were unmistakably twisted inward. It wasn't a tragic accident or a twist of fate. John and Mary B. had not simply vanished into the vast desert. They had been deliberately silenced, sealed inside a steel and stone coffin, and hidden where no one was ever meant to find them. Mary's condition, bilateral club foot, is a birth defect where the muscles and tendons of the foot and ankle are shorter than usual, causing the foot to turn inward. This condition, if left untreated, can make walking difficult and painful. It is often corrected with a series of treatments, including stretching, casting, and sometimes surgery. Mary's unforgettable steps were a poignant detail in the narrative, not only because of her limp, but because they symbolized her innocent presence and vulnerability in a world that would ultimately prove to be so harsh. The Navajo community was shaken by the disappearance of John and his young daughter, Mary B. However, the authorities seemed uninterested in finding them. For John's wife, Sarah, the full weight of the situation hit her on the second day, not because she had lost hope, but because she saw how little the world outside her community cared. At first, the tribal police acted without much concern. They questioned Sarah in ways that felt disrespectful, asking if John might have left her, if they had domestic problems, or if he was in debt. Sarah was furious. Her husband was a devoted family man who had dedicated his life to his community. He would never abandon his wife, and especially not their disabled daughter, who depended on him for help with even simple things like walking. Yet the police seemed to be dismissing him as a runaway, even before a real search had begun. When family and friends organized their own search teams, exploring dirt roads and canyon paths, they noticed something strange. The police refused to let them search certain old mining areas and wells, claiming they were too dangerous. Instead, they directed the volunteers toward main roads and easier trails. Sarah knew this was wrong. These forbidden areas were exactly where John would have been looking. Just a few days before he vanished, John had mentioned to her that he was planning to investigate an area near Lope, where unauthorized trucks were moving equipment onto Navajo lands. He suspected a secret deal had been made between local officials and a mining company to reopen old wells and start test drilling without the tribe's permission. Sarah had urged him to be careful, and now, those were the very places the police were avoiding. Rumors began to circulate in the community. Everyone knew John was outspoken. He carried a worn leather folder full of evidence, including illegal permits, statements from workers who had transported coal in unmarked trucks, and even photos of bulldozers near sacred burial sites. At a tribal council meeting just a week before he disappeared, John had publicly accused powerful figures, including the county sheriff, some council members, and a foreman from a coal company. He had declared, "You are poisoning our water, you are taking our land, and you are lying to our people." His words were brave but also dangerous. After that meeting, Sarah remembered John coming home worried. He told her he felt like he was being watched. At night, trucks would park near their house with their headlights on before driving away into the desert. Once, while taking Mary to the doctor, he told Sarah that a black SUV had followed him for miles before leaving. He didn't tell her everything, but she could see the heavy burden he was carrying. In the days after he went missing, the whispers became more sinister. A gas station worker remembered seeing John's truck late at night, stopped near the highway with another vehicle close by. A rancher claimed he heard yelling across the mesa, followed by the sound of engines speeding away. Another man, after a few drinks, hinted that John had gotten what he deserved. Each story pointed to the same conclusion: this was no accident. But when Sarah begged the police to investigate these tips, they dismissed them as unreliable gossip. What made Sarah's pain worse was the way Mary was ignored. The police only listed John B. as the missing person, treating Mary as a minor detail. They didn't even mention her disability, her distinctive clubfoot, which would have made her easy to identify. To Sarah, this was unacceptable. Her 2-year-old daughter wasn't a side note, she was a victim. But to the authorities, she seemed to be invisible. After 1 month, the official search was reduced. The helicopters stopped flying and the deputies stopped taking Sarah's calls. When she asked for an update, she was told the case was on hold until new evidence appeared. Yet, Sarah was convinced that the evidence wasn't missing, it was being hidden. The more she tried to find answers, the more she was met with resistance. John's cousin, who had been helping with the search, quietly told her that he had been warned by men at his door to stop getting involved. Another person who had been vocal about the case suddenly fell silent after their truck was damaged. People in the community began to avoid Sarah, not out of malice, but out of fear. Sarah's grief was made even heavier by her isolation. She was a widow in all but name, burdened with unanswered questions, and a system that seemed to protect those who wanted to keep the truth hidden. Each night, she sat alone, holding Mary's rag doll and looking at the cradle her husband had built. The wind blowing through her house seemed to carry the unstated truth. John and Mary hadn't just vanished, they had been intentionally removed. Even so, Sarah refused to give up. She began writing letters to journalists, senators, and human rights organizations. She explained that her husband was silenced because he had exposed corruption. She told them that her daughter was seen as just a disposable consequence. Although most of her letters went unanswered, she continued to write because she believed the desert still held them, and she swore that one day the truth would be revealed. Following the disappearance of John and Mary in the fall of 1996, a mere 2 months after they vanished, the Begay family began to grasp what Sarah already instinctively knew: this was no simple missing persons case. Every effort to seek assistance from law enforcement was met with indifference or avoidance. When questioned by reporters from Flagstaff, the county sheriff's office provided a single, non-committal statement: "There is no evidence of foul play at this time. We believe the individuals may have left the area voluntarily." The word voluntarily enraged Sarah. How could they possibly suggest a father would willingly abandon his wife, his job, and his entire life to disappear with his young, disabled daughter in the harsh Arizona desert? For those who knew John, this explanation was a clear insult. Yet for those in positions of authority, it was a convenient way to close the case. Behind the scenes, a more sinister reality began to emerge. One of John's cousins, who was independently searching the grazing lands, returned home visibly shaken. He reported finding new tire tracks near an abandoned well, leading off an unmarked service road. When he reported this to the sheriff's office, they dismissed his claim, calling it old rancher traffic. He later returned to the site and discovered the tracks had been intentionally erased with shovels, a deliberate act to conceal evidence. A school teacher and supporter of John's activism also confided in Sarah, revealing that he had been approached by men in plain clothes who warned him to stop asking questions. His voice nervous, he told Sarah, "They're making an example out of him, and if you don't stop, they'll do the same to you." Sarah's life became an ordeal of constant intimidation. She noticed trucks idling outside her home late at night, their engines running for a few minutes before driving away. One day, a black SUV drove slowly past her while she was hanging laundry. The driver's face was hidden, but his eyes were fixed on her. When she tried to report these incidents to the tribal police, she was told she was overreacting. To Sarah, it was becoming increasingly clear that the system wasn't just ignoring her. It was actively protecting someone. Meanwhile, the documents John had been meticulously working on, the folder he had guarded so carefully, had disappeared with him. Sarah frantically searched their home, but the papers were gone. At the tribal office where John had kept duplicate copies, she found his filing cabinet had been forced open and emptied. The council secretary offered only blank stares and suggested, Maybe he never filed anything. But Sarah knew better. She had seen him spend countless nights highlighting names and dates, determined to prove corruption. The theft of those files was, to her, the most compelling evidence that John had been silenced because he possessed information too dangerous to be made public. Mary's absence was an unbearable weight. Sarah constantly replayed her daughter's voice in her mind, her soft lisp saying "Dada," and the sound of her clubbed feet shuffling across the floor. At night, she was tormented by dreams of her daughter reaching out to her from the darkness. What made her pain worse was the lack of official acknowledgement of Mary. The little girl's name vanished from reports, her very existence treated as a mere afterthought, as if a 2-year-old child had never mattered enough to be remembered. By 1997, a year after the disappearance, Sarah's grief had solidified into an unwavering obsession. Her walls were covered with maps of the desert, marked with every well, abandoned shaft, and road John might have taken. She organized vigils where candles flickered and prayers were whispered in Navajo. Yet even at these gatherings, a palpable fear lingered. People would come, light a candle and quickly leave, afraid that showing solidarity with Sarah might bring trouble to their own homes. The rumors grew darker. Some claimed a sheriff's deputy was seen drinking with a coal company foreman on the very night John disappeared. Others said they overheard men laughing about a job done clean. One Navajo rancher swore he saw John's blue Chevy being towed on a flatbed truck near Loop late that night, but refused to repeat the story publicly. This climate of fear was precisely what the powerful relied on to keep people quiet. Sarah began documenting everything. She filled notebooks with dates, names, and whispered stories, details no one else seemed to care about. To her, this wasn't just gossip, it was the truth, the scattered pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to solve. Despite her resolve, she was haunted by one thought: her fragile little girl, Mary, who needed help with every step, had been taken into that silence. The thought of her daughter being alone, frightened, or worse, was unbearable. As much as Sarah wanted to believe Mary was still alive, deep down, she knew that whoever had taken John had likely not spared the child. The men who had erased her husband would have no reason to keep his daughter alive. For Sarah, grief was a constant companion, but so was defiance. Whenever officials told her to give up, she would clutch Mary's worn-out rag doll and whisper, "I won't stop, not until I bring you home." The desert had hidden its secret, but Sarah was certain it would not remain hidden forever. Sarah B's life was irrevocably altered by 1998, 2 years after her husband, John, and daughter, Mary, vanished. The home she shared with her family became a painful memorial to their absence. John's handmade cradle sat in a corner, gathering dust, and Mary's little shoes, worn unevenly because of her club foot, were placed on a shelf, one of the few physical reminders Sarah had left. Every object in the house both comforted her with memories and tormented her with the reality of their disappearance. Yet Sarah was a woman of unwavering resolve. When the authorities gave up, she took up the search herself. When the community was too afraid to speak, she collected their stories. Her sorrow transformed into a relentless determination to find out what happened. She began her own investigation, saving money from long hours at a Tuba City trading post to fund her search. On weekends, she would comb the desert, often alone, armed with a flashlight, rope, and notebooks. Her focus was on abandoned wells and collapsing mines. She would lower a light into dark shafts, calling out their names and praying for a reply. Each time she came back empty-handed, she would mark the location on her map with a red X, a growing reminder of her fruitless search. Her relentless quest made her a target. One evening she found her truck tires slashed. Another time she returned home to find her notebooks torn apart and names crossed out. Nothing else was taken. The message was clear: stop looking. But this only strengthened her resolve. She began reaching out to people beyond the reservation, sending letters to journalists, advocacy groups, and organizations that tracked missing indigenous people, a movement that had not yet gained widespread attention. Most of her letters went unanswered, and the few who responded politely dismissed her, stating they could not act without evidence. Still, she persisted, meticulously documenting everything in binders, as if the act of record-keeping could one day bring justice. As the years passed, time seemed to stand still for Sarah. Every August 12th, she held a vigil on the edge of the desert to mark the anniversary of their disappearance. Sometimes only a few people would attend, but other times dozens would gather, holding candles and praying. Sarah always stood in front, clutching Mary's rag doll, speaking their names, John B., Mary B., and repeating her vow to never give up until she brought them home. The long search took a heavy toll on her. By the early 2000s, her hair had turned gray, and her face was etched with lines from sleepless nights and desert winds. Friends encouraged her to move on, but Sarah refused. She believed she couldn't start a new life until she knew where her family was. Rumors never stopped. A ranch hand claimed to have seen men moving something heavy near a well. A relative mentioned hearing a story about a truck that never returned. Even a retired deputy hinted that he had been told to not look too closely. Each fragment of information was frustratingly incomplete and unverified, but it confirmed what Sarah already believed: this was not an accident. By 2005, a decade after the disappearance, Sarah had become a symbol of persistence in her community. Children who had once been Mary's playmates now grew into teenagers and would ask her what happened to her daughter. Sarah would respond gently, "She is with her father, and one day they will come home." However, her persistence came at a price. Fear made many in the community avoid her, not because they doubted her, but because they were afraid of being associated with her. Sarah became an outcast, respected but alone. In 2008, she took her fight to the Navajo Nation Council. Holding up Mary's tiny shoes, she demanded that they reopen her husband's case. Her voice trembled but did not break as she accused them of allowing her family to be buried and silenced for 12 years because they stood in the way. She ended her plea by asking, "Tell me why no one will look." The council chamber was silent. While some delegates looked away and others offered excuses, nothing changed, but her words left a lasting impression. For 14 years, Sarah carried this burden alone. She mapped the land, prayed at wells, and pleaded her case to anyone who would listen, but John and Mary remained missing. Their fate was sealed in silence. Then in 2010, the silence was finally broken. A work crew clearing brush came across a hidden, forgotten well. When they used a hook to pull out what they thought was scrap metal, they discovered a rusted, sealed, and dented trunk. When Sarah arrived at the scene, she knew with a deep certainty that this was the answer she had been searching for. The trunk was heavy and covered in rust. Its lock fused shut. Investigators used crowbars to pry it open. As the lid slowly lifted, sunlight revealed skeletal remains inside, huddled together. The sight caused a collective gasp among the crew. There were the bones of a man, and beside him, the smaller, more fragile bones of a child. Sarah stumbled forward, clinging to Mary's rag doll. For 14 years, she had yearned to know where they were. Now she was faced with a horrifying truth. Investigators began to carefully catalog the bones. Sarah, though tearful, saw what confirmed her worst fears: the small, curved spine of a 2-year-old girl and the unmistakable deformity of her feet. It was Mary. There was no doubt her daughter had been here all along, trapped in that iron box. John's remains also told a tragic story. His ribs had fractures and one arm showed signs of an old, untreated break. Near his wrist, rusted fibers of rope still clung to the bone, indicating he had been tied up. This was not an accident. It was a murder. But the cruelest discovery was what the bones of his daughter revealed. Mary had no signs of injury. She had likely suffocated to death in that trunk. The thought of a helpless, disabled toddler suffocating beside her father, who was unable to save her, crushed Sarah. She pressed the rag doll to her lips and wept uncontrollably. The trunk itself offered chilling clues. Scratches on the inside of the lid showed that John had desperately tried to claw his way out. His fingernails had scraped the iron, leaving behind a testament to his final struggle. And with him, Mary's bones told the story of an innocent child whose life was taken because of her father. Forensic teams also discovered something else among John's remains: fragments of paper tucked into the lining of his coat. They were almost illegible, but one word stood out: permits. It was the same word Sarah had heard whispered in council halls, the same word John had ranted about. It was the evidence he had been gathering against illegal drilling and the officials who had ignored it. Even in his last moments, he had tried to carry proof. When the trunk was finally closed again, Sarah felt hollow. She had begged for answers, but the truth brought only devastation. Her husband and daughter had not simply disappeared. They had been intentionally silenced, locked in a box, and discarded. The news spread quickly. Reporters swarmed the reservation. But beneath the headlines about the discovery, the real story emerged: the corruption and conspiracy John had died to expose. For Sarah, the discovery was not an ending but a beginning. It confirmed that her 14 years of suspicion were not madness but truth. John and Mary were erased because they were a threat, and the well had swallowed both their bodies and the evidence of injustice. Sarah wiped her tears, her voice steady. "You didn't bury them," she whispered. "You just kept them waiting, and now the truth is out." When news of the trunk's discovery spread, local media descended upon the site, their reports filled with somber and dramatic language. For the first time in 14 years, the names of John and Mary B. were spoken beyond the Navajo reservation. However, for Sarah, this attention was a double-edged sword. It proved she had been right all along, but it also felt like a slap in the face. She had spent over a decade pleading with authorities to search the wells, only for the truth to be found by chance. The local sheriff's office quickly offered their condolences and promised a full investigation, but their words meant nothing to Sarah. The same office and the same deputies had dismissed her pleas in 1996, telling her to accept her family's disappearance as an accident. Now, they were acting as if they cared. To Sarah, their hypocrisy was unbearable. The FBI was called in at the request of tribal officials, but their investigation was immediately hampered by resistance. Important files from 1996 were missing, witness statements had vanished, and logs from the sheriff's office showed mysterious gaps in the days following John's disappearance. It was as if someone had deliberately erased any record of a proper search. But the trunk itself provided undeniable proof. Forensic experts confirmed that John's ribs had been broken by blunt force and rope fibers were found on his wrist. Mary's identity was confirmed by her clubfoot. The most crucial piece of evidence, though, was a fragment of paper from John's notebook. After using infrared imaging, investigators could make out the words mine, road, and sheriff, in addition to permits. These words pointed to the very corruption John had been fighting. Journalists quickly uncovered that in 1996, a large energy company had been attempting to expand a mining operation near Navajo land. John B. had been a vocal leader of the opposition, accusing county officials of accepting bribes to illegally approve the necessary permits. One reporter even found a meeting transcript from 2 weeks before John's disappearance that referred to him as an obstructionist who needed to be handled. This chilling discovery confirmed Sarah's worst fears: her husband had been intentionally killed, and her 2-year-old daughter Mary had been an innocent victim. The realization that Mary, with her twisted feet and radiant smile, had been collateral damage tore Sarah apart. Community reaction to the news was mixed. Many people rallied around Sarah, bringing her food and offering prayers, validating her long struggle. But others remained afraid, whispering that she was digging up a dangerous past. Old men on the reservation warned that the powerful people responsible were still watching and that Sarah was putting her own life at risk. However, Sarah had nothing left to lose. In a powerful press conference, she held Mary's doll and declared, "My husband did not vanish. My daughter did not wander off. They were taken, they were silenced, and those who did it are still out there." Her defiance sparked a movement. Activists began using the B case as a symbol of systemic neglect and corruption against indigenous peoples, with banners reading, "Justice for John and Mary B." Sarah began to receive letters from other families who had lost loved ones under eerily similar circumstances, transforming her grief into a sense of solidarity. Despite the new attention, local officials tried to downplay the findings, calling the trunk inconclusive evidence and insisting there was no proof of foul play. One outrageous press release even suggested that John might have voluntarily crawled into the trunk. But Sarah had seen the truth with her own eyes. Late at night, she would spread out her binders of documents, staring at the words permits, mine, and sheriff on John's note. The story was now clear. John had been silenced because he threatened the powerful, and Mary had been silenced because she was his daughter. After 14 years of searching for her family's bodies, Sarah was now on a quest for justice, a fight she knew was only just beginning. Sarah quickly learned that truth and justice were not the same. Officials continued to twist the narrative, and even the FBI seemed hesitant to pursue leads. Refusing to let them bury the truth again, she started traveling across the Navajo Nation, sharing her family's story and connecting it to a larger pattern of corruption and violence. She spoke of her husband's fight against illegal mining, the documents he carried, and the horror of Mary's innocence being no protection. Each time she spoke, the emotional impact was profound, and she felt less alone in her struggle. The B case became a symbol, and national media attention grew. Though she was reluctant to relive her pain, Sarah knew she had to speak out to prevent her family from being erased from history. During a rally, a former truck driver named Raymond approached Sarah and confessed that he had witnessed the abduction in 1996. He said he had seen 2 trucks, including John's, at the well site late one night. He remembered hearing an argument about permits, seeing a child crying, and hearing a trunk being dragged. Fear had kept him silent for years, but now he felt he had to come forward. Sarah begged him to speak publicly, and though he worried about his safety, he agreed, knowing that silence had already claimed 2 lives. Days later, his explosive testimony was recorded by a small investigative outlet. However, Raymond's courage came with a price. He began receiving anonymous threats and reported being watched. Sarah also noticed strange vehicles near her home. The same fear that had silenced witnesses in 1996 was back, but Sarah and Raymond refused to be intimidated. Sarah told the press, "They can threaten us, but they cannot bury us again. The well has already spoken." Raymond's testimony was a breakthrough, but the danger was real. 3 nights after the article was published, Raymond called Sarah, terrified, saying he was being watched. Despite her pleas for him to come to her house, he refused. 2 days later, he was dead. The official report called it a single-vehicle accident, but the scene didn't add up. There were no skid marks, his seatbelt was cut, and a dash recorder he always used was missing. Sarah was heartbroken, but her grief quickly turned to fury when a local reporter gave her copies of Raymond's old shipping logs. One entry from 1996, just before John vanished, listed an address as Well Storage with the word Sheriff written next to it. This was the irrefutable link between law enforcement and the mining company that Sarah had always believed existed. Raymond had been killed not just for his words, but for the proof he had left behind. With the new evidence, the FBI was forced to act. They returned to the well site and, using ground-penetrating radar, discovered more sealed containers nearby. The whispers that had been spreading through the community about other missing people now seemed validated. When investigators opened the first of these new trunks, they found human remains that were older than John's. The FBI went silent, but Sarah knew in her heart that her husband had not been the only one to pay the price for speaking out. As the danger to her grew, she refused to leave her home, telling friends, "If I leave, they win." At a press conference, she held up Raymond's shipping log, declaring, "This is proof that what happened to my husband was not an accident. If they think they can scare me now, they don't understand. I've lived with fear for 14 years. It no longer owns me." Her words echoed across the nation, and for the first time, John and Mary's names were spoken in Congress. Sarah sensed a final confrontation was approaching, and she was ready for it. By the autumn of 2010, Sarah B. was a national figure, hailed as a truth-teller and a symbol of defiance. The discovery of more trunks at the well site had shattered the official narrative. The FBI cautiously admitted to finding additional remains, but the details were kept from the public. However, the community understood. The whispered names of other missing people now seemed to have a connection to her family's case. With every new truth, however, came a new threat. Sarah's house was broken into, but only John's notebooks and copies of key documents were stolen, a clear warning. Days later, a leak from the sheriff's department revealed a log entry from 1996. A deputy had received a tip about banging and voices at the well site on the night John vanished, but had been told to take no action because the site off-limits per sheriff. For Sarah, this was definitive proof that law enforcement had not just failed her but had actively protected those responsible. The retired sheriff called the note fake, but the public outcry was immense. Congressional hearings on missing and murdered indigenous people were announced, with John and Mary's case at the forefront. The night before her testimony, as she clutched Mary's doll, Sarah reflected on her journey. She knew that this was the moment John had died for, a chance to speak the truth in the very halls of power. On her way to the airport, a dark SUV nearly ran her off the road, but she held firm. The same forces that had buried her family were now trying to silence her, but she knew they would not succeed. With her grief as her armor, she boarded the plane for Washington. In the congressional chamber, with no one but her family's memories to support her, Sarah gave a powerful testimony. She spoke of John's laughter, Mary's twisted feet, and his fight against corruption. She held up Mary's doll and told the lawmakers that her family's story was a symbol for all Native families whose lives had been erased. The room was silent, and her words had an effect. The FBI's investigation expanded, and more rumors of trunks and remains surfaced. Then, a manila envelope was left at Sarah's doorstep containing copies of documents, including a memo signed by the sheriff from 1996 that read, "Problem handled. No further searches authorized." It was the proof John had died for, and someone wanted her to finish the fight. Formal justice never came. The sheriff died and the mining company dissolved, but the truth had been set free. Back in her community, a simple stone marker was erected near the well site in memory of John and Mary. For Sarah, this was not closure but a promise. A promise that her family's memory would live on in the fight against erasure. As she stood before the stone holding Mary's doll, she whispered, "You are not gone. You are not forgotten. And as long as I have breath, your truth will never vanish again." The wind seemed to carry her words, a silent testament that the earth itself remembered, and the long-hidden secrets were stirring, waiting to be revealed.